My name is Anika Winston from Collaborate, and I'm here hosting this episode with.
Gabriel Eichsteller from Tempera.
Welcome to another episode of our podcast series, Changing the Narrative, in which we're exploring and sharing insights from various human learning systems examples of practice that have what we think are interesting and helpful insights into embedding equity practices and principles into work. We hope this series is valuable for everyone, but particularly for practitioners who would like to better understand how human learning systems practice can intersect with intentional equity and inclusion practices. Today, we're joined by Lola Akindoyin, who has been involved with Hackney Council in partnership with Sport England, working on a whole systems approach to reducing physical activity inequalities. Before we begin, it would be really helpful if you could share a bit about Hackney as an area.
Thank you. So first of all, I'm always going to fly the flag for Hackney. It's a borough in East London that is very dear to me because I grew up in Hackney and lived there for quite some time. So I don't live there anymore, but it's a great borough to work in and to do this work. And we have a population of about 280,000, I think, at the last census count. We're an incredibly diverse borough and a borough with lots of green spaces, really dynamic, and quite a young population as well.
Thanks. And do you want to just tell us a little bit about this project and how did it come about that you had a partnership with Sports England?
Sure. So this project is funded by Sport England, and essentially it's about looking at how we can achieve a whole systems approach to reducing inequalities in physical activity within our borough. And the work actually started specifically in a particular area of Hackney called Kings Park. And the main reason for bringing this work to Hackney was recognizing that actually, for a variety of reasons and due to a range of inequalities, we actually had a lot of people who were physically inactive and that was having a negative impact on health outcomes. And so recognizing that in order to improve health, physical activity is a core component, moving your body on a regular basis, but not necessarily having a detailed understanding of sort of what could work, but also a really detailed understanding of some of the root causes. So we started this work along with 11 other places across the country that Sport England were also investing in. And we started this work so that we could almost do that, to design something that came from deep insight, that developed that real understanding of why those inequalities existed, but also that gave us the opportunity to test and learn from the things that we were working on. And yeah, I think, the learning that's emerged from those different places has been really, really important in terms of kind of thinking about ways of working.
Great, thanks. That gives a really good insight. And you're already mentioning, obviously the kind of inequalities, health inequalities around physical activity. Can you tell us a bit more about how you considered equity within your project? What were some of the things you might have done or some of the ways in which you thought about it?
Sure. So I think certainly for the way that we've approached this work in Hackney and also the way that I work is about trying not to make any assumptions or jump to any conclusions as to why things are the way they are, and to also try and build as full a picture as possible. And so some of that information and the way of doing that is based on things that already exist, information, data, etc. But for me, I remember really in our early days always talking about wanting to see the people behind their data. So there was kind of like lots of statistics about like the level of particular, like the prevalence of particular health conditions, or about people's sort of economic situation and poverty, and a range of those different things. But actually it's only by really being willing to get into further detail and to connect at a very kind of like granular community level where you begin to build up a better picture. And so for me, I feel like one of those key lessons is about, data is good and absolutely has a place in everything that we do, but also insight, informal insight and stories are also really valuable and really important because I think they are the things that also humanize. So that's one of the starting points, is that we had a really strong commitment to building a picture of insight to help inform the work that we would then go on to do.
Thanks. And what kind of insights did that reveal in terms of inclusion and equity in particular?
Sure. So for all sorts of sort of different reasons or different ways, that when we think about community, it's understanding who is in the community. So some of that was around kind of looking at ethnicity, age, demographic data that gave us some indication of who was in the community, but also being really kind of keen to understand. So what does physical activity mean to you? Kind of where are the opportunities within your life to be more active? What are you doing at the moment? But also, what are the things that are perhaps stopping you? And I feel that what became really apparent really early on is that some of the things that people were saying were really not to do with individual behaviours, and a lot of them were to do with structural inequalities. And so, although we were probably aware of some of that stuff, I think that the emphasis or the onus can often be on if somebody just did this, if somebody made more time, and if somebody got up and did this, like almost again that emphasis on like the person needing to change behavior. But actually, the fact that somebody doesn't have an extra 15 minutes of time because they have two jobs or because they're busy taking their children, like caring responsibilities, and then they have to rush somewhere else to do other caring responsibilities, maybe for an older parent, because of like multi-generational households, and then rush back to do get the children to school before then going to something else. And like all these, like a real picture of just how people's lives are. And therefore, I think it really started to, give clarity about, well, if you're going to design a program, or if you're going to, work with people, you have to see them in their entirety in order to then respond in a kind of human way, in a human-centered and person-centered way, but also recognizing that, because if you see someone in their full, as they are, we also recognize that inequality has, been present in people's lives in lots of different ways, and therefore how that shows up impacts on how people are able to live and show up today. So there's all of the kind of historic context, and then how you bring that into recognizing that these inequalities didn't necessarily develop overnight, or often many of them didn't, and therefore in terms of what we're doing today, we have to be able to see all of that, but we also have to recognize how those inequalities show up in people's lives.
And so rather than kind of doing the convenient thing for us, perhaps to just individualize these issues and blame people for their own health inactivity and the outcomes for that, it requires a very different kind of sense of being really attuned to some of those structural issues. And I know in your example of practice, you're talking about sort of being trauma informed, being anti-racist, being inclusive, tackling those inequalities from the root, being relational rather than transactional. So I'm curious, to what extent do you think that way of thinking, that way of approaching, to what extent was that radical, or to what extent do you feel like it had a fertile environment within the local authority and within Sport England?
I think that the foundations for doing that work and working in that way were there, but I'm not sure that I would say, I don't think it was particularly radical, but I also don't think it was really embedded. I think both organizations have been on a journey with working in that way. So there is, and also I think for me, all of those things, relational working in an anti-racist way, thinking about inclusion, they are things that you have to continue practicing and doing. So you're never done with that work. Like you're always like striving to reduce those inequalities and to ensure that equity is embedded within your work. For both organisations, although they were on different journeys and in different places, with Hackney absolutely being kind of at the kind of vanguard of working like this. So I think the fertile ground really was that both organisations were committed to doing some work that really did provide that kind of approach that is something that is about almost a commitment to practice. So, like if you're focused on inequality, if you're focused on equity, it's about kind of building that level of understanding across an organization or across organizations, so that it does then like literally develop in practice, and it's a way of working. I think that's the key thing that I would really stress with this, is that it is a way of working as opposed to something that you do and then you feel is completed. It's something that it's a continued practice. And both organizations were in different places on their journey with this work, but absolutely, having that commitment to really understand and see communities in their entirety and recognize those structural barriers and inequalities as being key to needing to address in order to kind of provide more equity.
Great, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. And I wonder, you're mentioning the communities there. What was their perspective in terms of inequality and disadvantage? To what extent did they embrace what you were doing? To what extent were they trusting of that or of your intentions, or maybe a bit cynical? Or
So when we started this work, we very much wanted to take an asset-based, so a strengths-based approach to working, which was really recognizing all of the fantastic and great things that exist within a community. And yet, I do think that some of the early decisions that we made and some of the approaches almost kind of gave the sense of the opposite. And so for the community, that there was a bit of a sense of, well, why us? Like, why are you, coming to focus on us? And actually, what is this really going to mean? Which I think is that, these are legitimate kind of questions and considerations that anyone would have. But for this work, I do think one of the things that I feel has been positive, and I hope others would too, is the opportunity to do something that's been quite long term and to build some relational working, and particularly for communities or places that feel that they haven't really kind of had much really good engagement or have seen the benefit of that way of working. And also that it's not something that we would just do overnight. So that sort of building the collaboration through building the relationship and being able to continue showing up and continuing to be present and continuing to have conversations and build those relationships has then gone on to deliver some really great pieces of work. And it reminds me of a couple of projects that we've had where initially, I think we were maybe struggling a little bit to work together. So, different parts of, two different organizations trying to find their way, but both recognizing that we had projects that we could deliver together that would really benefit the community. But actually, I'd say it's been through the commitment to showing up. So the fact that we'll keep talking, and if we encounter problems, that we have joint responsibility for trying to resolve those issues. That's been really key. But at the heart of it, I think it's been about kind of approaching this as people who want to do something good and want to achieve a positive outcome together, right? And because of that, it's very small things, but we show up and we've adapted. Both organizations have had to adapt their ways of working a little bit. Yeah. So community-based organization who value, trusted relationships. They spend social time together. They are informal in terms of, some of the meetings that they may have, the way things are structured. And then sometimes working with kind of quite tight, bureaucratic, overly formal processes that sometimes exist within the public sector. But we had to find a way of working. So actually being able to work out what was going to work best for us within that partnership in a way that was very human-centered has worked well, because it's allowed us to do the work, but it's also allowed us to adapt to the circumstances that's needed. But by doing that, it's the thing that's gone on to then deliver the best outcomes.
Thanks, Lola. I really liked what you said about collaboration to build relationships and showing up and how in building that trust you can then work together to create these positive outcomes and it becoming a way of working. I'm curious, how did you think about shifting power in terms of those ways of working and what did you do to make it possible?
Sure. So, in some respects, I think it's really important to recognize those power dynamics from the outset and where they show up, why they show up, and also are they really necessary? So, sometimes processes or things are in place and they're not like a particular way of working can change. Like it can be adaptable. And there are a number of things that we did that I think they were uncomfortable but they were also part of being able to test and show that different ways of working are possible. So there's a couple of things that immediately spring to mind. One of those is around governance and the need for like quite traditional board structures and to provide oversight to things, like whether it be key performance indicators or oversight, like doing that sort of function. But I think there is almost a tension between that type of function and actually what does this really mean for people living in a place and on the ground, and who should be helping to steer and shape and scope the work. So does it make sense for that type of thing to happen within a board that's providing oversight and actually is quite disconnected or distant from the place where actually things are that we're starting to try and achieve or work in and do work together? So we changed that so we don't have that type of structure and then moved to something that was much more community rooted. Now, I'd love to sort of finish that by saying, and it works really well, but actually that wasn't necessarily the case because again, it was really important in terms of scoping and steering and, co-designing and thinking about things and understanding that lived experience and insight. But actually what we really needed is some of those people on the other oversight board to work on some of those structural barriers. And so actually it was about how do you sort of create space to bring those together. So I definitely feel that a lot of our work has been about facilitating and convening and bringing people together to work on a particular outcome. So that's one example. And then the other example I would give is quite a practical one again around we were recruiting some architects to work on one of our capital projects and working very much with an organisation who they place a huge amount of emphasis on trusted relationships and actually have experienced and the community that they're obviously serving has also experienced a lot of inequalities where all sorts of things have shown up in terms of funding commissioning processes of the past that have impacted on kind of their organisation. And so to some extent had kind of a number of examples of why they should be skeptical about working in partnership and in collaboration. But just because they're busy doing so many other things and have skills and knowledge and experience in so many other areas, we're not going to be able to kind of show up and participate in an overly kind of technical kind of procurement or commissioning type process that we need to have because that's what kind of procurement legislations, etc., require us to have in place as a public sector body. And so wanting to bring all of that together into some sort of process that would enable everybody to feel like we'd actually collaborated to successfully recruit someone, an architect that could work with this organisation. And so we started to talk through how that might be present or how that might be possible. And it was by just like making amendments, but ensuring that each of the partners could play to their individual strengths. So from a kind of council perspective, we knew that we could actually manage and, do all the paperwork and everything for the formal procurement process. We didn't need our community partners have to get involved in all of that design of the tender specifications and etc. What we needed from them was to ensure that we had covered the right things, that we were articulating the things that were really key to them in some of that technical language, but also not wanting to speak for them, how they wanted to be represented in the specification. And so they decided that, and the way they wanted to do that was to create a video that accompanied, it was part of the tender pack, so that they could articulate and explain exactly what it is that they wanted. And actually, it was far more important for that element of it, because that brought it to life, but also they are the key stakeholder here. So again, just thinking about how we each played to our strengths so that we could then end up with like a really good specification.
That's really interesting, and there's a lot there. I'm curious, you said earlier there was discomfort in that process in terms of doing things differently, moving away from kind of program management structures and those that focus on KPIs. What helped you get through those moments of discomfort? What was helpful to move from that uncomfortable feeling towards action?
That is a really interesting question. And I feel slightly hesitant to say this, but I also believe that it's very true in relation to the HLS work. You have to believe in it. So in like the principles that you believe, and not just like not blind belief, but you know, you have to believe that a way of working is going to provide more equitable outcomes. You know, like you have to recognize your own self in the work, and at times it does mean being a you know, a bit of a lone voice, or it does mean, you know, perhaps being sort of, as I say, a bit on your own in terms of championing a way of working. Although I do think that very quickly you do find like allies. So, you know, your coalition of people that actually get it, they understand it, and they're also kind of willing to work with you. But as with anything that is about change, people will question it, and, you know, and will also perhaps feel like it's creating more work. And in these times when people are very busy, you can understand that to some extent. But there is something greater here around actually how we move beyond the kind of the easiest or the obvious work. It's not easy to like unpick or work through like long-standing inequality that's kind of really baked into a system. So actually that is the work, is to do that, and it is tough and it is hard. But actually the more people that are willing to do it, then actually, you know, you can start to make some of those inroads. And so I feel like connecting with other people who, you know, will support that way of working, who you can learn from as well, and who will encourage, because that's also really important. But also you have to believe that what you are doing and the approach that you are taking is going to lead you to a better and more equitable place. I think for me that's the key message.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really fascinating, and I think we hear a lot about the kind of, it comes from your own personal values and beliefs and sense of purpose, doesn't it? That kind of really attracts people to human learning systems. So I wonder, in what ways has HLS helped you promote equity within your project? What did you learn about sort of that connection between equity and inclusion and a human learning systems approach?
I would say that we're still building that as a kind of a standard approach, but I definitely would say that through her human learning systems, we've had a lot of opportunity to reflect and show the importance of collaboration, and doing that with the, you know, the right people in the room. And when I say room, I don't literally mean room, but the right people involved in developing these areas, these sort of areas of work, or, you know, service design or interventions. And the thing I think with human learning systems is the recognition that you can't do this on your own. So it is about kind of, you know, coming together with others. It is about that point around kind of, you know, building in empathy within your approach, thinking about equity, very really centering that in your approach. And then through that work, I think the examples of practice are coming through. And in a way, like the next step now is to keep building those examples of practice so that it is fully, you know, like so that people really can see that this is a bit of a movement, right? Like that if you work in this way, there's enough examples of practice to demonstrate that this way of working really does build those outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the encouraging thing, that it actually leads somewhere, and it usually leads somewhere much better, much more equitable. Um, I'm curious, at what point did you come across human learning systems? Was it was the project built explicitly on an HLS frame, or did you just use that to kind of guide your own approach or to kind of find allies?
So I hadn't heard of human learning systems specifically, so it almost happened the other way around, that as like we were already working in a particular way, and then I started to hear more actually through colleagues that collaborate around human learning systems and the opportunity to get involved in that work in a bit more detail. And so that then involved like joining a community of practice and then being with others who were sharing examples of a way of working that I'm not sure many of us at that time, used the term human learning systems, but it was the commonalities and the golden thread through all of our work that really highlighted that we were working in a HLS way. And for me, the thing that I really like about this is that it does talk about the need and importance of learning and reflection, and then also, of course, being human and person-centered in the way that we approach things. And the point around learning, I do think, is another one that's important to highlight, because again, for us, that there has been a little bit of a tension around that, almost as if learning is a bit of a luxury, like to stop and reflect. But actually, I feel like the really important thing about the learning elements of this work is the fact that when you do that reflection and you do that like deep reflection with others, then it does really help to highlight where things need to change. And if we remain focused in this very kind of action oriented, like delivery way, like it actually doesn't allow us to stop and really be thinking about, well, how well is this working? And crucially, in relation to equity, who is this working for?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's then something in there as well about like the process of learning and being transparent and being self-critical also has the opportunity to build trust in these relationships, doesn't it? And I think very often, particularly in public services, and particularly when it comes to supporting communities that have been marginalized, we can't just automatically assume that there'll be trust, they'll be interested and see our positive intentions. You mentioned in the conversation we had before that it took a lot of continuing to show up, continuing to want to build a relationship to actually gain that trust. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Definitely. And I think that I'm quite fortunate to work in a borough like Hackney, where as a council, working with like community sector partners, there's always been quite an emphasis on partnership and collaboration and a kind of mutual respect and understanding of the different roles that those sectors play. However, that doesn't mean that it's always perfect and that those conditions are always perfect. And certainly for the area of the borough that we were working in, there was a sense that actually, geographically it's quite isolated, and so there was a sense from the community about kind of, well, sort of, well, what does this program now mean, like, and almost we don't have that much regular connection with either the council or with others. And so and also I think it's important to say that we were doing this work during COVID, and we were doing this work when George Floyd was murdered, and that actually, in the area and the borough that we work in, we've like, got really diverse population. I think in Kings Park, 60% of the community from a non-white population. So people's experiences of state, public sector, etc., are very different, and how that then kind of how we worked within a community where all of that context is happening, absolutely meant that we needed to think quite carefully about how we were showing up, the way that we were doing it, being consistent, being open, hearing to things that aren't working. I had a lot of that. And again, I think within this work, there's also something about recognizing like who you are, and sometimes you like needing to hear stuff that can be quite challenging. So the need for your own support is really important. But actually, making sure that we were remaining open and investing in those relationships, and also being told, and we were told on a number of occasions about things that weren't working. So again, I'd go back to the point about being adaptable. There were things that we started that, if we'd continued doing them, would have caused more harm, really, or damage than good, because we were getting very strong messages about this isn't the way that we want to work with you, and this isn't the way to work with us. And even sort of something, it feels like a small example, but to give, but I think it's quite a useful one in the context of this conversation. When we were doing some work around evaluation and learning and trying to understand impact, and we were very keen to get case studies and things like that, and we had like a really great spreadsheet that we wanted the organizations to complete, to tell us who was coming, the frequency, etc., etc. And our community partners really were really clear, this isn't going to work for us. This isn't the work that we're doing, and what you're asking us to capture is not the right information to capture. This isn't going to work for us. And actually, we may not be 100% sure. Some partners were clear about what they felt would work, and others were like, we're not 100% sure what's going to, but what we do know is that this isn't it. And so that process of kind of being like, okay, so this isn't working. We thought that we'd sort of, tried to design something that could be quite helpful, and evidently wasn't. And actually, what they did was really tell us and work with us to say, this is about you having a deeper understanding of what it takes from us in order to get to this outcome with people that are coming to our organization and supporting them. And actually, what we want to do is to spend time with each other, telling each other stories. So we're sharing practice in that way. And then it's for you to capture that, reflect that back to us to make sure you've captured it correctly. And then we collectively are telling a story. And that's exactly what we did. And they went on to produce like a really fantastic report that had kind of like their own individual case studies that were much more in depth than I think the little box that we had on our spreadsheet that we thought was going to tell us something. But also, by saying to us, where you can be helpful is by looking for the commonality across the different case studies. So that again, trusting us. So the trust was coming back to us that you can do that, and then share with us to make sure that we've got it right. That again goes back to that kind of asset base of like everybody playing to their strengths. They didn't need us to get overly involved in giving them like the structure for how they had to tell us their story. They took much more ownership, which is absolutely right, and it just required that conversation. But again, I'm not entirely sure we would have been in that place if we hadn't pre-built some relationships. So the organisations were quite happy. We've got brilliant organisations in Hackney anyway that would tell us stuff. But they were happy to tell us stuff, but also we were happy and willing to listen.
Yeah, that is such a great example. And I think it really highlights that when we think about equity, we can't just think about it from our perspective. We might feel like we're super inclusive, we're providing all of these things, but actually ultimately what comes across as equity is how it's perceived by the individuals and communities that we're meant to support.
Yeah, I also think there's something really powerful there about kind of the trust and the relationship building, that those organizations felt they were able to say what's not working, and they weren't kind of worried about the impact that could have and the power dynamics of that, to be able to say, actually, we want to do it this way, and this is the support we want from you. I think it's really amazing.
Thank you. And I think also taking the time to understand like why it wasn't working for them. So I think that again, that point around kind of like listening and openness and willingness to understand, and it reminds me of something else about a sort of a partner organisation that we've been working with, which is the sort of the same organisation where we're doing we were looking to get the architect in, and they were saying, I remember having the conversation, and at one point, and this was a key teachable moment for me, I think, when they were saying, lots of people tell us all the things that we're not doing and that we should be doing, but nobody actually really offers us any help. And, again, for me, I thought that was really interesting, is that we can often show up and say, oh, well, we need you to work in this way or not that way, but we don't actually really get into, well, okay, so we're giving these messages, but the bit in the middle is, do we need to help navigate, or do we need to change or adapt in order to enable and support an organization to do the stuff that they're really fantastic at? So again, we've all got different roles to play within this work. And actually, when you bring them together, you get something really fantastic. And that's much better than keeping, them being siloed.
That was all really interesting. There's been so many great insights that you've shared with us across the course of this conversation. I'm curious, from your point of view, what do you feel like others can learn from your example of practice that might help them to become more equitable in their own work?
I think that possibly some of the things that I would share are about, again, a little bit of reflection about your own ways of working. And so your own belief systems, what you bring to the work, and being confident in that is really important in this work. I would also say that the thing about, it's something you have to keep working on. So, and you may think, okay, so we tried this and it worked really well, either with this community, this organization, this group, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to work like with another organization. So the point, and I think I've used this word a few times actually, about being adaptable, and how important that is within this work, and in the approach that one takes, and also being willing to give something a go, being willing to work a bit differently. There of course will be some things where that's not possible, but actually sometimes very small adjustments can make a huge difference. So just being willing to do something a little bit differently. I've heard when we were doing the examples of practice, even things like going into like a different setting for your meetings, going down, being in a community, like going out, which to me, I didn't think that was anything like, I think that's just a way of working. You don't always have to come to my house. I'm quite happy to come to yours. Like, even just taking that kind of approach. And when I say that about my house and that, I mean, that's my life. I'm not divorced from who I am as a person just because I come to work, right? So it's even, just thinking about things in that way. Like, why would they always have to come to an office? Like, when we could go out and spend more time in communities. So I think even some of those things that aren't huge, but actually can really make a big difference to partners and communities that we're working in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's how those small shifts can actually make big differences in the long run. I'm wondering as well if you could tell us, so you said in your example of practice, you talk about a leap of faith into the unknown. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that as well, and why that's important to this kind of work.
I think it's important to this kind of work because in some respects we're very much conditioned to try and work to an absolute point of certainty. But this work needs space to evolve because we have to learn from it. So, and so in order to do that, we have to take a bit of a leap of faith. So we start from the belief that this can change. We work, together to think about how we might make that change, but there is no certainty there. So there has to be a leap of faith and a willingness to take that and to go on that journey. And that's not just, again, it's not just like randomly jumping. Obviously, we think about as much as we can around the design of things and working with people. But I think one of the key things around some of this work is, for example, you can often start something and then realize that you maybe don't have the right people in the room, and therefore you have to you started with something, but you have to, of course, you have to take it in a different direction, and you can bring some new people into the room, but that still doesn't mean for sure that you're going to get exactly where you plan to. So that point around, like, take a leap of faith, but also don't be afraid to change it if it's not working, or if actually something else emerges, then again, don't be afraid to change it. So the leap of faith is necessary, in order to do something different, in order to learn, and in order to change.
Thanks. That sounds really encouraging, actually. And I think what you explained previously suggests also that when we build relationships, when we do collaboration well, then we're taking a collective leap of faith, but also we'll have this opportunity to check in with the others. Like, is this actually working? Are we moving in a direction that's helpful? And they will have the confidence to kind of let us know whether things are having the impact that we're hoping to have, or whether it does need adapting. So I think there's something about when we do this in relationships as human beings, with a rigorous kind of learning process, then it becomes perhaps a safer leap of faith. I don't know if that's the right way of putting it, but
Yeah. And I think in a way it becomes a leap of faith that you're taking with others. So you're not doing it alone. And so, together you believe in something. So you kind of, you're like, yeah, this is going to work. And you have that belief, but also there's a sense of, if it doesn't, we'll work it out together.
yeah. And between us, we will know whether it works or not, because we're the more we have that diversity in the room and different perspectives and people with lived experience and people directly in the community, the better we can get immediate feedback on whether it's going the way we're hoping or whether it does need adjusting. So I think there's also something about kind of, again, playing to each other's strengths, as you've said quite a lot, and also valuing the different kinds of perspectives and contributions and areas of expertise that people bring.
Definitely.
I have one question, and that is about endings, and particularly when you take a very relational approach. How do you make sure that it doesn't just kind of all depend on you as a person, given that people change jobs, people move to different parts of the country or world? So I'm just curious about your experience there in terms of, like, how can we take some of that into account, particularly when things might have to come to an end?
I think relational working is really, really important, but I think one of the risks of relational working is that it can be about relationships with individuals. And so what I would prefer to see, or what I try to think about, is how we build cultures of connection. So how do we, like, literally, facilitate connections between lots of different people, so that if an individual within that kind of system, or within that kind of space of connection, isn't there anymore, there are still others that can keep that connection going and that relational way of working going. So I do feel that that's probably something to just flag. Is how does, it's almost like the point about everybody can lead, and how does everybody kind of like commit to this, like, to working in this human learning system way, and embedding this approach within the work. Because if it becomes like the sole focus of one person, then that's very risky and it's quite difficult to maintain that as a way of working. But actually, if we're building and facilitating this as a way of working across systems and across a local area or within a program of work, I think that's one of the ways of mitigating, having endings that then end up having really significant ramifications on the work. So in a way, almost my role is to help build those relationships in lots of other places and across different parts of the system and with different people, so that the work can continue regardless of who's actually in the room.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that makes lots of sense, and I love that idea of cultures of connection. That's certainly something I'll keep mulling over and keep coming back to. That is just really brilliant. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, and obviously thanks to all the listeners for tuning in. Until next time, then take care.